Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us again here at the Weekend Bible Study. If you've been following along in this study, you know that we're in the book of Ezra. Last week, we finished up with the first phase of the book, which chronicled the beginning of the reconstruction of the temple, all the way up to the completion of the temple. Ezra 3:8 tells us that construction began on the temple in the second month of the second year after their arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem. Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the people began the work. And that corresponds to April of 536 BC. And we're told the exact time the temple was completed in verse 15 of Ezra 6. It says this, Ezra 6:15, "The temple was completed on the third day of the month Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius." And that corresponds to February 21, 515 BC. So the second temple was completed from start to finish, along with all the delays, in 21 years. Chapter 6 ends with the celebrations of the dedication of the temple and the observance of the Passover and the days of unleavened bread. Chapter 7 begins the second phase of this book, which is the account of Ezra's journey to Jerusalem and his role in the spiritual guidance of God's people. The first 5 verses establish Ezra's genealogy, and verses 6 and 10 enumerate some of his abilities and achievements that qualified him to go up to Jerusalem to be a ranking priest and teacher of God's law. We started getting into chapter 7 last week, and I spent a little time talking about when Ezra's trip actually took place. Was it 58 years or so after the temple was completed? Or was it the following year? This is a big consideration one needs to make at this point in the study. Are you going to disagree with some of the all-time great Bible commentators and believe something contrary to popular opinion? That's a big consideration, isn't it? Here's what my friend William Struess has to say about disagreeing with the conventional wisdom of established Bible commentators. And I quote, "I mean, what kind of person argues with the opinion of some of the greatest biblical chronologists of all time? Okay, I must admit I'm raising my hand timidly from the back of the room. But with all due respect to these great men, it seemed to have been a case of each thinking the other had done his homework. In this case, their messianic zeal caused them to make an assumption which is unsupported by biblical chronology." End quote. As it is with any given field of expertise, the experts don't always get everything right. And when any one of them build their arguments on somebody else's inaccurate work, the inaccuracy is perpetuated, and it becomes more difficult over time to refute. For those of you who are students of the Bible, I know you realize that there are any number of things that many biblical experts believe and teach that are out-and-out antithetical to Bible teachings. And this is where the Bereans would be challenged to take it upon themselves to find the truth of the matter. I want you to take that challenge and do some serious studying on your own so you can make your own decision. And remember what we're told in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. "Prove all things, hold fast to that which is good." My opinions will be obvious as we read through the rest of Ezra, but you need to come to your own conclusions. Now let's read the first part of verse 1 of chapter 7. And it begins, quote, "After these things." Okay, let's pause there and think about what's been happening in the previous 6 chapters. Ezra, of course, wrote this, and he just finished writing about the completion of the temple in chapter 6. If this were 58 years after the temple had been completed, what on earth was he referring to? After what things? There would have been a lot of things that happened in the space of 58 years. Isn't it logical that he's referring to the recent events regarding the rebuilding and completion of the temple? Let's reread the first part of verse 1. "After these things, during the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Okay, let's pause again for a moment, because we need to determine just who this king is. Skip down to verses 7 and 8. Verse 7 says, quote, "Some of the Israelites, including priests, Levites, musicians, gatekeepers, and temple servants, also came up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes." Verse 8. "Ezra arrived in Jerusalem in the 5th month of the 7th year of the king." Now keep in mind that the temple was completed in the 6th year of King Darius, and that's in Ezra 6:15, which says this: "The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius." End quote. And Ezra arrived a little more than a year later in the 7th year of the king, that is, King Artaxerxes. Now let me reiterate here that the term Artaxerxes is a title like the title Pharaoh. It's not a name. Wouldn't it make sense that Ezra would come to Jerusalem at this time rather than 58 years later during the reign of Artaxerxes Longimanus, like many of the Bible commentators believe? Well, now let's finish reading the rest of verse 1 and then continue reading to verse 6 so we can get a glimpse of his genealogy. Ezra 7:1. "After these things, during the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, son of Sariah, the son of Azariah, the son of Hilkiah, the son of Shallum, the son of Zadok, the son of Ahitub, the son of Amariah, the son of Azariah, the son of Meraioth, the son of Zerahiah, the son of Uzai, the son of Bukai, the son of Abishua, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the chief priest." Now, why is Ezra's lineage important? Sometimes we don't need to pay much attention to genealogies, but it's important that Ezra included it here. And why is that, you might ask? Well, it shows that he's the son of Sariah, who was the last chief priest in Solomon's temple, and he was killed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. And you can read about that in 2 Kings 25, 8 through 21. We can know that that's his father because they have the same lineage. And here's a quick review of how we arrive at Ezra's age. We don't know how old Ezra was when his father was killed in 586, but he must have been very young. He was probably an infant. If Ezra was born the year before his father was killed, that would have made him 51 years old in 536 BC, the year of Cyrus' decree. And when the temple was completed in 515 BC, he would have been about 73. It's a year later here, so he would be about 74 or 75 at this point, not 130. Now here's an interesting factoid I just discovered when I was looking at Sariah's genealogy. And his genealogy is found in 1 Chronicles 6, beginning in verse 3. Notice verse 14. It says this: "Azariah, the father of Sariah, and Sariah, the father of Jozadak." Do you remember reading that name when we were talking about Zerubbabel and Joshua being in charge of the exiles in Jerusalem? Well, let's turn to Ezra 3 and read verse 2. Here's what it says. Ezra 3:2. "Then Joshua, son of Jozadak, and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates, began to build the altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what was written in the law of Moses, the man of God." Now go back to Sariah's lineage, and I'll reread 1 Chronicles 6:14. 1 Chronicles 6:14 says, "Azariah, the father of Sariah, and Sariah, the father of Jozadak." Then it says this about Jozadak in the next verse, 1 Chronicles 6:15. "Jozadak was deported when the Lord sent Judah and Jerusalem into exile by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar." So Jozadak was Ezra's older brother. And since Ezra was so young, it may have been Jozadak who had custody of Ezra while in exile. since we don't know what happened to their mother. But that being said, Joshua the priest, who was Zerubbabel's sidekick, was Ezra's nephew. We don't know the ages of Joshua the priest or his father Jozadak, or if he's even alive at this time. But the fact that we can prove Sariah is Ezra's father and Joshua is his nephew makes it more credible to believe that Ezra is more likely to be in his 70s here than nearly twice that age. At least that's the way it seems to me. Now let's move on to verse 6. Ezra 7:6. This Ezra came up from Babylon. He was a teacher well versed in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. The king had granted him everything he asked, for the hand of the Lord, of his God, was on him. Verse 7, some of the Israelites, including priests, Levites, musicians, gatekeepers, temple servants, also came to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. Ezra arrived in Jerusalem in the 5th month of the 7th year of the king. Verse 9, he had begun his journey from Babylon on the 1st day of the 1st month, and he arrived in Jerusalem on the 1st day of the 5th month, for the gracious hand of his God was on him. So it took Ezra's group 4 months to make the journey back to Jerusalem. Verse 10, for Ezra had devoted himself to the study and observance of the law of the Lord, and to teaching its decrees and laws in Israel. This is a copy of the letter King Artaxerxes had given to Ezra the priest, a teacher of the law, a man learned in matters concerning the commands and decrees of the Lord for Israel. Verse 12. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, teacher of the law of the God of heaven, greetings. Again, it's my opinion that this is King Darius, and he's also known as King Darius the Great Artaxerxes. Verse 13. Now I decree that any of the Israelites in my kingdom, including priests and Levites, who volunteer to go to Jerusalem with you, may go. Now that the temple was complete, there may have been some people who decided to move to Jerusalem who didn't wish to make that move initially, back when Zerubbabel and Joshua first went up with their group of 42,000 people or so. It was now about 22 years later, and Jerusalem and the surrounding towns were much more established. Verse 14. You were sent by the king and his 7 advisers to inquire about Judah and Jerusalem with regard to the law of your God, which is in your hand. King Darius is really kind and generous to Ezra and this group going with him, and he was like that for Zerubbabel too. His personality and generosity is further evidence to me, anyway, that this is in fact the same king that dealt with Zerubbabel and Joshua as they were finishing up the temple. Look how he's loading them up with silver and gold, and there's going to be a lot more to come once they get to Trans-Euphrates, as we'll soon read. Verse 15. Moreover, you are to take with you the silver and gold that the king and his advisers have freely given to the God of Israel, whose dwelling is in Jerusalem. Ezra 7:16. Together with all the silver and gold you may obtain from the province of Babylon, as well as the free will offerings of the people and priests for the temple of their God in Jerusalem. With this money, be sure to buy bulls, rams, and male lambs, together with the grain offerings and drink offerings, and sacrifice them on the altar of the temple your God in Jerusalem. You and your fellow Israelites may then do whatever seems best with the rest of the silver and gold, in accordance with the will of your God. Deliver to the God of Jerusalem all the articles entrusted to you for worship in the temple of your God, and anything else needed for the temple of your God that you are responsible to supply, you may provide from the royal treasury. Now I, King Artaxerxes, decree that all the treasures of Trans-Euphrates are to provide you with diligence whatever Ezra the priest, the teacher of the law of the God of heaven, may ask of you. Up to 100 talents of silver, 100 cores of wheat, 100 baths of wine, 100 baths of olive oil, and salt without limit. Now, according to Wikipedia, the Babylonian talent was equal to 67 pounds. 100 talents would be 6,700 pounds, and that would be about 107,000 ounces. Right now, silver is selling for about $15 an ounce. So 100 talents of silver at today's prices would be about $1.6 million. And that's just the silver. They were going to get a lot of gold, too. Well, how much is 100 measures of wheat? The NIV calls that 100 cores of wheat, and a core was a little more than 75 gallons. So that would be more than 7,500 gallons of wheat. And what was a bath of wine? Each bath was 7 gallons and 5 pints. So 100 baths would be more than 700 gallons of wine. Fortunately, they didn't have to carry all of this with them. They would be able to get more of this in the vicinity of Jerusalem, trans-Euphrates. The letter continues in verse 23. Whatever the God of heaven has prescribed, let it be done with diligence for the temple of the God of heaven. Why should his wrath fall on the realm of the king and his sons? Now, this is an interesting verse. He's revealing here that he has a certain amount of fear for the God of Israel. He wants to make sure he doesn't shortchange God in any way that would bring wrath on his family. And he said something similar to this when he was dealing with Zerubbabel back in chapter 6. Here's what he said in verse 9 and 10 of Ezra 6. Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, male lambs for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, and wheat, salt, wine, and olive oil, as requested by the priests in Jerusalem, must be given them daily without fail, so that they may offer sacrifices pleasing to the God of heaven and pray for the well-being of the king and his sons. So, in both letters, he wants to please God to ensure the well-being of his family. The king continues his letter to Ezra, but before we continue, let's take a short break. And now verse 24. Ezra 7:24. You are also to know that you have no authority to impose taxes, tribute, or duty on any of the priests, Levites, musicians, gatekeepers, temple servants, or other workers at this house of God. This letter isn't just for Ezra. This is an official letter for all the authorities to see in trans-Euphrates. And this verse made sure there would be absolutely no taxation on the temple or anyone who worked there. Interestingly, this verse got the attention of our American founding fathers, and it was this verse that inspired our founders to make sure that places of worship and religious ministries would be free from government-imposed taxes. Verse 25. And you, Ezra, in accordance with the wisdom of your God, which you possess, appoint magistrates and judges to administer justice to all the people of trans-Euphrates, all who know the laws of your God, and you are to teach any who do not know them. Whoever does not obey the law of your God and the law of the king must surely be punished by death, banishment, confiscation of property, or imprisonment. That's probably the end of the king's letter, even though there's no formal closing. Ezra is talking in the next two verses, which close out chapter 7. Verse 27. Praise be to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, who has put it into the king's heart to bring honor to the house of our Lord in Jerusalem in this way, and who has extended his good favor to me before the king and his advisers and all the king's powerful officials. Because the hand of the Lord my God was on me, I took courage and gathered leaders from Israel to go up with me. And that's the end of chapter 7. The first part of chapter 8 is a registry of the family heads and how many there were in each family. You can read this list on your own, and I think it would be a bit tedious if I were to read the entire list. So let's read verse 1 and then skip down to verse 15. Ezra 8:1. These are the family heads and those registered with them who came up with me from Babylon during the reign of King Artaxerxes. Verse 15. I assembled them at the canal that flows toward Ahava, and we camped there 3 days. When I checked among the people and the priests, I found no Levites there. Now, Ahava is just south of modern-day Baghdad, in case you're curious, and this was Ezra's gathering point for all of the people going to Jerusalem with him. And when Ezra did a roll call, he didn't have any Levites. So he summoned some of the leading men of learning and instructed them to recruit some Levites so that they would have Levitical attendance in the house of God. Verse 18. Because the gracious hand of our God was on us, they brought us Sherebiah, a capable man, from the descendants of Mahli, son of Levi, the son of Israel, and Sherebiah's sons and brothers, 18 in all. Verse 20. They also brought 220 of the temple servants, a body that David and the officials had established to assist the Levites, and all were registered by name. So all of the people that are going to make this trip are gathered together, and they're essentially ready to roll out. I don't know the total number of people that went up on this trip. The numbers that Ezra wrote down amounted to less than 1,800, but there may have been more that were unaccounted for. What happens in the next 3 verses is illustrative of what a wise man of God would do when he's responsible for so many people. Verses 21 through 23. There by the Ahava canal I proclaimed a fast, so that we might humble ourselves before our God and ask him for a safe journey for us and our children with all of our possessions. I was ashamed to ask the king for soldiers and horsemen to protect us from enemies on the road, because we had told the king, the gracious hand of our God is on everyone who looks to him, but his great anger is against all who forsake him. End quote. So we fasted and petitioned our God about this, and he answered our prayer. It doesn't say how long they fasted. It was probably for just a day. But think of the trip that they were going to be making for the next 4 months. And think of all the silver and gold they were carrying. They were prime targets for marauding bands of outlaws. Back then, there were entire city-states that depended on vulnerable sojourners such as this group. King Darius was exceedingly generous, and he may have gladly provided armed horsemen and soldiers, but Ezra told him God would watch over them and protect them along the way. This not only exemplified Ezra's faith, but I think it also shows how much the king believed that Ezra's God would protect them. The king also had a lot to lose. He was supplying much of the gold and silver as well as other valuable commodities, and if the group had been terrorized and ransacked, or even worse, it might have made the king look bad for not protecting them. He could have insisted on sending an army to protect them, but he didn't. Given his generosity and respect for the God of Israel, which was evident in both of his decrees, I think he sincerely believed God would protect them. We see the examples and dramatic results of fasting frequently throughout the Bible. Even in early America, the biblical model of fasting was followed hundreds of times. In recent years, this scripture has been popping up more and more, and you may even have it memorized. It's 2 Chronicles 7:14. You know the verse. If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. Many past presidents have proclaimed days of prayer and fasting when the country was in trouble. And I'd like to read a portion of one of those proclamations that was made by John Adams, our second president. He made this proclamation on May 9, 1798, when we were about to go to war with France. And I quote, "As the safety and prosperity of nations ultimately and essentially depend on the protection and blessing of Almighty God, and the national acknowledgement of this is not only an indispensable duty which the people owe him, but a duty whose natural influence is favorable to the promotion of that morality and piety without which social happiness cannot exist, nor the blessings of free government be enjoyed, and as the United States of America at present placed in a hazardous and afflictive situation by the unfriendly disposition, conduct, and demands of a foreign power. I have, therefore, thought it fit to recommend that Wednesday, the 9th day of May, next be observed throughout the United States as a day of solemn humiliation, fasting, and prayer. That the citizens of these states, abstaining on that day from their customary worldly occupations, offer their devout addresses to the Father of mercies, agreeably to those forms or methods which they have severally adopted as the most suitable and becoming. That all religious congregations do, with the deepest humility, acknowledge before God the manifold sins and transgressions which we are justly chargeable as individuals and a nation." End quote. Now, that's just a portion of his proclamation, and there have been so many others like that over our history. It's difficult to even imagine a modern-day president proclaiming such a day of humiliation with fasting and prayer. It's sad and tragic, isn't it? But maybe even more sad and more tragic is the fact that our churches aren't even willing to call for corporate fasts. When was the last time your church called for a day of fasting? Or when was the last time you fasted? Maybe one of the reasons our culture has deteriorated so much is that the church has deteriorated right along with society. It's kind of scary to contemplate the possibility that Christians may have some culpability for the decline of our country. But, as they say, I digress. All right, that brings us to verse 24, and Ezra begins to distribute the vast amounts of gold and silver to the various men who would be responsible for their safe transport. Verse 24, "Then I set apart 12 of the leading priests, namely Sherebiah, Hashabiah, and 10 of their brothers. And I weighed out to them the offering of silver and gold, and the articles that the king, his viziers, his officials, and all Israel present there had donated for the house of our God. And I weighed out to them 650 talents of silver, silver articles weighing 100 talents, 100 talents of gold, 20 bowls of gold, valued at 1,000 derricks, and 2 fine articles of polished bronze, as precious as gold." Verse 28, "I said to them, You, as well as these articles, are consecrated to the Lord. The silver and gold are a free will offering to the Lord, the God of your ancestors. Guard them carefully until you weigh them out in the chambers of the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, before the leading priests and the Levites and the family heads of Israel." Then the priests and the Levites received the silver and gold and sacred articles that had been weighed out to be taken to the house of our God in Jerusalem. On the 12th day of the first month we set out from the Ahava Canal to go to Jerusalem. The hand of our God was on us, and he protected us from enemies and bandits along the way. So we arrived in Jerusalem, where we rested 3 days. On the 4th day, in the house of our God, we weighed out the silver and gold and the sacred articles into the hands of Meremoth, son of Uriah, the priest. Eleazar, son of Phinehas, was with him, and so were the Levites, Jozabad, son of Jeshua, and Noadiah, son of Binnui. Everything was accounted for by number and weight. The entire weight was recorded at that time. Then the exiles who had returned from captivity sacrificed burnt offerings to the God of Israel, 12 bulls for all Israel, 96 rams, 77 male lambs, and as a sin offering 12 male goats. This was a burnt offering to the Lord. They also delivered the king's orders to the royal satraps and to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, who then gave assistance to the people and to the house of God. So they're now safe and secure in Jerusalem. I always wish that they would have told us more about the long journey from Babylon to Jerusalem. I think it would have been extremely interesting. Well, that's where we're going to stop for tonight, and we should be able to finish the book of Ezra next week. So be sure to come back next week for the conclusion. Thank you for joining us. Have a terrific week. Good night, everyone.